But there's a lot more that could be said, but maybe it's best to answer questions and tailor things to your interests. Yeah, there's one big difference, and that is that Shiites believe that the legitimate ruler of the Muslim community has to be a lineal descendant of Muhammad through his daughter Fatima and his son-in-law and cousin Ali, and their sons Hassan and Hussein. So, and the most Shiites are Twelver Shiites. That is, they believe that there were 12 legitimate imams. They reject the Sunni Muslim caliphs, starting with the very first one, Abu Bakr, Uthman, and so forth. And they think Ali was the only legitimate one of that first generation. And then they trace 12 legitimate imam. They call it the imam, not the caliph. And then the 12th one, he didn't die. He went into occultation or hiding in 873. He's out there somewhere. And he's going to emerge at the end of time and convert everyone to Islam and slaughter all the enemies of Islam. And so what Shiites believe is that offensive jihad is not legitimate unless led by the imam. He's not around, so now you can't wait. So since 873, they've been against waging offensive jihad. But they do believe that defensive jihad is still an individual obligation. So, so that's why, Hezbollah is as gung-ho about eradicating Israel as Hamas, with Hezbollah being Shiite, Hamas being Sunni. So that's the big...
So there's not there's some theoretical differences, but functionally they're...
Not a big difference. Yeah, right. Especially when you're, when it comes to, say, fighting Israel or fighting the American invaders in Iraq or Afghanistan. Yeah. The hadith, what I have read is that in a region that was conquered by Muslim arms, as opposed to the population voluntarily surrendering or converting to Islam, in the mosques, at the pulpit, there's always a sword displayed to send a message that this territory was conquered by force of arms. So that is
but they're appearing here in America, in mosques here in America, specifically Lewiston.
Oh, really? I hadn't heard that. And there is a famous hadith where Muhammad said, "Paradise is in the shade of swords." There are all these hadith where Muhammad. Jihad is one of the highest activities. It's clearly extolled, violent, in the sense of warfare, is extolled as one of the most meritorious activities, and certainly some of the richest rewards in heaven for martyrs are for those who died in jihad. And in fact, it's interesting, if you look at the definition of martyrdom in this book, it makes it very clear that to be a martyr, you have to die fighting for Islam. It's not enough that you were killed instead of recanting your belief in Islam or something like that. Jewish and Christian notions of martyrdom usually involve someone being persecuted, being forced to perform an act of idolatry, let's say, by the Romans or whoever, refusing to do that and being killed. That's our paradigm of a martyr, right? This book makes it expressly clear that such a person is not a martyr. Only the person who dies fighting for Islam, bravely, advancing, not retreating, is a martyr. And those martyrs have special rights in heaven, rights to intercede for their friends and relatives. They enjoy, most Muslims believe in an intermediate stage of punishment for your sins, where it's sort of like the Catholic notion of purgatory. You're going to go to heaven, but you have to be punished first for your sins. If you die a martyr, all that punishment is lifted. You don't undergo any punishment at all, no torment in the next life. You go right to paradise and so forth. Yeah. So, anyway. And so these are all spelled out in the hadith and to a lesser extent the Quran.
Is it possible that since they were polytheistic before Muhammad showed up, that's a pagan symbol taken from the one God that they chose to be Allah? The crescent.
The crescent. Oh, that's an interesting idea, and that's a possibility. I'm not.
God. Is reference to moon god, Allah.
You know, that's possible. And I have to admit, I don't know much about the origins of that symbol. So, but that sounds like an interesting hypothesis.
Email
There.
Qatar and ask him, I bet he knows.
Yeah, I bet he would. I bet he would. Yeah. You know, I'm trying to think of. I mean, certainly, I'm aware of the Muslim Brotherhood and their global network of organizations that is doing just that, or trying to do just that. But in terms of the classical Islamic law, there's not. I mean, that's rooted in the classical Islamic worldview mainly in one way, and that is that this notion that Muslims are destined to rule and not to be ruled. That another hadith attributed to Muhammad is Islam is exalted and nothing is to be exalted above it. Islam is superior and nothing is superior to it. That's taken to have a political meaning. That Muslims are not to be under the rule of non-Muslims. And in fact, in early Islam, back in the days when Islam was expanding and victorious, going from victory to victory, most scholars said Muslims should never agree to live under a non-Muslim ruler. They should migrate, if that ever happened, they should migrate back to Muslim lands because it's beneath their dignity to be governed by non-Muslims. And that attitude, which is sometimes captured in the phrase Islamic supremacism, that's clearly a part of this effort of soft jihad. That's motivating it, isn't it? And you find Yusuf al-Qaradawi, the guy I mentioned a moment ago, he's really gung-ho when it comes to insisting on the individual duty to wage what he calls defensive war against Israelis and against Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan. But he says, the time for offensive warfare has passed. That's passé. After all, we can emigrate to non-Muslim countries and procreate and convert people to Islam and organize and infiltrate their society and their government. And he's predicted quite confidently that Rome will be a Muslim city. There's a hadith where Muhammad predicts that will happen. And America will be a Muslim country. Sure, he's on record as saying that. But why try to invade them violently when we could just infiltrate them like that? So that's, yeah.
And just use our constitution to do it.
Right, exactly.
Dated back
Exactly.
to when?
Sorry?
Dated to
When did Yusuf al-Qaradawi say these things? He said it at a conference in Toledo, Ohio in 1999. That was when he could still get a visa to come to the United States. He can't do that anymore. But he's on record as saying it. He says it over and over again.
Which is what they're
I mean, certainly I think the notion of atonement for sin is there in Islam. The very act of participating in jihad is a kind of atonement. Muhammad, I mean, you have fasting in Islam, but Muhammad, like the Jewish tradition, generally rejected celibacy, for example, and, a lot of the Christian monastic ascetic practices were kind of rejected by Islam, and Muhammad, in one saying, Muhammad says, the asceticism of my community is jihad. So it's a religious act, and it is a way of kind of expiating your sins or atoning for your sins. Because going to war is painful. It involves sacrifice, doesn't it? But it's better than fasting. It's better than celibacy. and not just New Hampshire for Israel, the Hamas covenant in 3 different passages points out that that also the Lions clubs, the Rotary clubs, and the Freemasons, of course, and B'nai B'rith, of course, are all part of the global Zionist conspiracy. And when Islam is at the helm, they will all be eliminated. So if you belong to the Rotary Club, watch out. Oh, yes, okay, right. Taqiyya means dissimulation, or, in a word, dishonesty, pretending to be what you are not. So Islamic law, and this book right here, clearly permits lying under certain circumstances. A husband can tell white lies to his wife. That's permissible under Islamic law. And lying as a part of jihad is entirely appropriate. And in fact, Muhammad said, this is one of his famous sayings, war is deception, Muhammad said. I think Sun Tzu said the same thing, didn't he? And if that jihad then takes the form of political activity, or political sedition or subversion, then yeah, deception would be entirely acceptable under Islamic law. Right, right. I don't know. That's harder to justify in Islamic law. Now, on the other hand, this same fantastic scholar, that Ella Landau Tassaron, who wrote this article on jihad that I've made some copies of for you, she has the best study that I have yet come across on the status of non-combatants in Islamic law. It's available online, by the way. You can just Google. Her name is here. And also, by the way, I forgot to mention, I have my cards here. If there should not be enough copies of these, or if you could just email me, or if you have any questions, you can email me. I can send you PDFs of these or other articles. And anyway, she has a great study on on Islamic law as it pertains to the treatment of non-Muslim civilians in wartime. And it's the best thing I've come across. No other scholar in the world has done the kind of really painstaking work that she's done. And it's interesting that many of the best scholars on Islamic history and Arabic history are Israelis, are at Hebrew University and Tel Aviv University. It's Meyer Kister and Johannan Friedman and Uri Rubin and Ella Landau Tassaron. And what she argues, I think pretty convincingly as far as I can tell, and it's consistent with everything else I've read, is that even that prohibition, don't kill women and children, is a sort of non-binding directive. In other words, it's not a strict obligation. Islamic law, by the way, divides actions. It's not just the permissible and the impermissible. There are gradations of actions. There are actions that are strictly forbidden, like drinking alcohol, haram. There are actions that are discouraged, offensive to God, but not strictly forbidden. Divorce is one of those. Those are called makruh. Then there are actions that are just indifferent. Doesn't matter one way or the other. Then there are actions that are recommended, but not strictly obligatory, like manumitting a slave. Then there are actions that are strictly obligatory, like fasting during Ramadan. She doesn't use this language exactly, but the way I interpret her position, her summary of Islamic law, is that killing civilians, non-Muslim civilians in wartime, is offensive. That's not strict. It's not really forbidden. It's not strictly haram. It's couched. There are so many qualifications attached to it that it's sort of a general, but not really non-binding directive. So it doesn't have. It's not a really strong prohibition in Islamic law. And in fact, it's very different from killing Muslim civilians when Muslim legal scholars talk about using violence to suppress rebellions by Muslims within Muslim countries. So if a whole community rebels against the Amir or the Caliph or something like that, and they're all Muslims, then there are really strict prohibitions against killing women and children and civilians. And you can only kill the people who are armed and fighting, nobody else. Why? Because they're Muslims. So it's not like the scholars weren't aware of the distinction. They just didn't apply it to non-Muslim civilians in wartime. Their lives are held pretty cheap. Well, I guess first of all, there are different categories. If you look at Syria, the ruling sect is the Alawite sect. The Alawites are polytheists. They are idolaters. They are not Muslims. In the eyes of a traditional Sunni Muslim, the Alawite religion is really weird. It's a weird syncretic blend of pagan and Islamic and other elements. And so it's not really a branch of Islam, though some Alawites would deny that. And so, it's interesting. I gave this I gave this paper, Jihad and Just War, at the Association for the Study of the Middle East and Africa last November in Washington, D.C. And I'm arguing that jihad and just war are really antithetical to one another. They're very different. And there are all kinds of scholars who are denying that now, so I try to rebut them. But I got to the section on non-combatant immunity, and I summarized Ella Landau Tasseron's research on this topic. There was a State Department official in the audience, and he had just been in Syria. He was a liaison with the Sunni Muslim jihadi groups in Syria for the State Department, funneling non-lethal aid to these groups. And he raised his hand and he said, you know, your paper really resonates with me. He said, just a few days ago, I was in Syria talking to some of these Sunni jihadis, and they had just been massacring Alawite civilians in northwestern Syria. And he said, they were completely upfront about it and completely callous. They said they'd do it again. They're infidels who have no right to live. So
I thought the Alawites are part of the
Shiite. It's related sort of to Shiite Islam, sort of, but it's really different, and it has polytheistic elements to it. In fact, Mordecai Kadar made this point when he spoke at St. A's a year ago. I don't know if you remember that. He's written a book on Syria, and he showed, I think, a picture of an Alawite shrine to illustrate how a traditional Sunni Muslim would regard this as idolatry. Well, certainly in places like Iraq and Nigeria, northern Nigeria, and Syria, and Yemen, and
Somalia and Djibouti.
Central African
Yeah.
Republic.
Every nook and cranny.
the Central African Republic, most recently. Yeah, it's everywhere. One little bright spot seems to be Tunisia. There actually is a big enough block of moderate Muslims to be holding the Islamist party, Ennahda, in some kind of check. And they just passed a constitution that actually is more progressive than you might have expected. Now, but there have been assassinations there too, and it's not clear exactly where that's going to end up. But you're right. I'm afraid that's a pattern everywhere. I mean, in Egypt too. I would argue it's a good thing that the Muslim Brotherhood has been overthrown. Not that Sisi is some kind of moderate or a secularist. He's not. The new constitution that was just ratified, I guess, yesterday, I haven't actually seen a tally. I don't know if they've tallied up the votes yet, but I'm guessing it'll be ratified. Still enshrines Islam as the state religion. It still says Sharia shall be the principles of Sharia shall be the primary source of legislation in Egypt. And in my talk last April at St. A's, I talked about where that's led in Egypt since 1970, when that change was introduced in the Constitution. It still has led to a very repressive state with some of the trappings of what we call Islamism, but is really just traditional Sharia. So, I glimmers of hope here and there, maybe Tunisia, but
That's great news.
Turkey is going from bad to worse with Erdogan becoming more authoritarian by the day. Yeah, I mean, it's a bleak picture, isn't it? Morocco is sort of a somewhat brighter picture too.
Any feel?
By the way, the king in Morocco, I just recently heard a talk by a leader of the Jewish community in Morocco. There are about a few thousand Jews left in Morocco. Most ended up leaving after 1948, but I heard a leader of the Jewish community talk, and he was praising King Mohammed of Morocco. He said, just recently, King Mohammed, at his own initiative, funded the renovations and repairs to all the Jewish cemeteries in Morocco because he knows how important that is in the Jewish faith, how important it is to attend cemeteries and to respect the dead in this way. And he did it at his own expense and on his own initiative. The Jewish community didn't even ask him to do it. He saw that there was a problem and he immediately jumped in and funded this.
Do you have any feel for the atmosphere in Libya because Muammar Gaddafi had written his own version of the Quran and persecuted all the other clergy to death.
Yeah.
How has that
He had a
changed?
weird, very
Yeah.
idiosyncratic interpretation of Islam, right? He wrote this green book, and the big problem I think Libya is the big problem there is tribal divisions. The primary allegiance is to the tribe, and the national government has just disappeared. There is no national government anymore. Gaddafi was it, and now he's gone, and they're just tribes, and they're fighting over the oil and everything else. And there are Islamists there too, as we know from Benghazi. Al-Qaeda is there. There's Osama bin Laden has an essay called "Moderate Islam is a Prostration to the West," and that title contains some truth, I'm afraid. It's in Raymond Ibrahim's book, The Al-Qaeda Reader. And in that essay, he says, now Ibrahim attributes it, he's pretty sure it's by bin Laden. I guess there's a little doubt. Some people think it's maybe Zawahiri. But anyway, I follow. Let's assume it's bin Laden. And he says in that essay, it's addressed to his fellow Muslims, not to Westerners. And he says, look, here's the crux of our conflict with the West. Islam demands that all of those Westerners either convert to Islam or pay the jizya in humble submission to Islamic rulers or die. That's our problem with the West. Now, when he writes Westerners, he uses the language of occupation, colonialism, resisting Western imperialism, self-determination of peoples, right? Because that's what will appeal to a Western audience. When he writes to his fellow Muslims, he goes right back to classical Sharia, right? Now, so there's some truth in that, I'm afraid. On the other hand, religions can and do evolve in surprising ways. Who could have predicted that? The Puritans in Massachusetts in 1630, who were all Trinitarians and double predestinarians, would spawn a Unitarian Universalist church 200 years later only. Who could have predicted that? Or who could have predicted that modern Reform Judaism, would come out, or at least has roots in the religion of Joshua and the ancient Israelites? Pretty different religions, right? So religions can surprise us. I mean, in a sense, Islam can be whatever Muslims choose to make of it, right? Yeah, and liberal Muslims are, besieged and often threatened with death and not infrequently murdered in Muslim countries. And when the talk I gave at St. A's last April, I mentioned some Egyptian scholars like Faraj Foda, who was murdered, Ahmed Mansour, who was driven out by the Muslim Brotherhood, and Nasser Abu Zaid, who was a kind of a liberal Quran scholar who was also driven out of Egypt. And so being a liberal Muslim is a dangerous thing. The problem, Islam is having trouble opening up to the modern world and all of its values: religious freedom, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, academic freedom.
Because then there are dissidents, and
as a Catholic, I have to say the Catholic Church had a similar problem until not too long ago. And Catholics were a little slower than Protestants to open up to modernity and embrace these modern values too. And it was only when was it, around 1850, that Pope Pius IX sanctioned the kidnapping of Edgardo Mortera, the Jewish boy in the Papal States. Have you read this book by David Kurtzer, The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortera? It's a heartbreaking book, doubly heartbreaking for a Catholic like me, really embarrassing. The Catholic Church was not quick to embrace the Enlightenment, shall we say. So, on the other hand, it eventually did, especially in Vatican II and in other ways. So it can happen. It can happen. If we Catholics can do it, then maybe the Muslims can do it too. Yeah. I mean, it's very complex because you have Al-Qaeda affiliated groups that are fighting, I guess, Sunni Muslim groups that are against them, that are aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood but are not quite Al-Qaeda. You know, it's not a huge difference, but it's a slight difference. But Al?
Okay, I'm sorry, but these alliances and that culture are negotiable. And
Yeah, I
so
suppose
they
they
can
are.
change by the hour.
Yeah.
And so, again, we're trying to measure these people, this culture, and this religion with our own mindset and
Yeah.
our culture, and it doesn't apply at all.
Yeah. There's always that danger. I guess I mean, the big picture is it's the Sunni Shiite split again. Syria has a Sunni Muslim majority, I think 60%. But the country has been run since the 1960s by the Alawites, who are only 10% of the population. And there's been tremendous violence. The Assad regime, both the father and son, have used tremendous violence to keep the Sunnis down, just like the Sunnis used tremendous violence to keep the Shiites down in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, and before that, and too. And you know, it's the old Sunni Shiite split. I mean, you know, Shiites often, you know, an outsider looking in doesn't see huge differences, and you wonder, why are they fighting? You know, but on the other hand, a non-Christian looking at Europe in the 1500s might say, well, you know, the Lutherans aren't all that different from the Catholics, are they? They have bishops, they have communion, they believe in the Bible. Why are they slaughtering each other? But they did. Sometimes the smallest differences lead to the most rancorous fights, you know?
But isn't that true of all of Islamic history? They've always been fighting each other.
It's
It's
a
just
long,
their culture.
yeah, the Sunni Shiite split goes right
Like
back.
Lawrence of Arabia.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
It's just the Middle
Yeah.
East. Well,
And there's never been a strong state or subordination to government and putting government ahead of tribe and that kind of thing, right? As you gave your talk on tribalism a while back. So that's a factor too, right?
big factor.
Yeah.
That's why Mordecai Kadar
Right.
just let them evolve to what it was, tribes and their territories, and then they'll quit.
Yeah.
Stone Age.
Yeah, that was Kadar said that. Now, you talked a couple things. One is the Sunnis again, being oppressed by the Alawites in Syria. Mordecai Kadar, a few months ago when he was here, said that if for whatever reason the Sunnis overrun the Alawites, they will decimate the Alawites.
They'll kill them all.
They'll
Yeah,
kill them all.
it'll be genocide.
So that's what he said. The people in the United States and
Yeah.
Western civilization, that we don't understand. It's not as if there's just a change of power. They'll be eradicated. So they're fighting to the death. Because
Right.
That's why the Alawites don't give up. That's what I thought that was.
They've been persecuted for centuries by the
Right.
Sunnis. Right. Yeah. So
that
out of fairness to them,
that
it's
doesn't
a
make-
winner take all
Right.
proposition here.
And
Yeah.
that's something that we don't understand
Yeah.
as Westerners. We're used to, okay, we lost,
Yeah.
day goes on, but
Or we're used to
So-
splitting the difference. We compromise, you
Right.
know, and we. But you know, it's just the Iranian leader Rouhani and other Iranians now are saying they've surrendered to us. This agreement is the West surrendering to us. It can't be. That's a pragmatic agreement. We didn't get everything we wanted. We gave up some things. They gave up some things. You
They
know,
didn't give anything.
better than wars. No, they surrendered to us, right? It has to be that way, because the culture otherwise will see
They have
them
to
as the
say it,
weak
they wanna
ones.
believe it.
Either we surrender or they surrender. It can't be a compromise.
So you mentioned Morocco. The king of Morocco, who's friendly towards the Jews, for whatever reason, I did read a few months ago that there's a legislature there in Morocco.
Right.
And the legislature has put through a bill that will forbid having any trade with Israel.
Oh, really?
So I don't know where
Huh.
that bill is, and no one knew what the king would do if it were passed.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard
Yeah,
that
so
at
that's,
all.
I know that was as of a couple months ago, I did know that.
Interesting.
And
What
Raymond
country?
Ibrahim, who you mentioned, people don't know, he's at Johns Hopkins University, that's where he's out of, he does the PhD program there and so forth. But he has death threats on him, so he lives in hiding
Uh-huh.
in the Washington DC
Does he
area.
really?
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
yeah, because he writes a lot about it.
I'm not sure what to say, except that it's a long-term problem, I think. And it is in many ways a clash of cultures. It's a, you're not supposed to say it, but I think Samuel Huntington was onto something. It's a deep cultural difference.
Who was onto something?
Samuel Huntington, who
Okay.
wrote the, what was his book? Clash of Civilizations, yeah.
Picking up on your comment about the clash of cultures and Brian's wildcard that he just threw out, how about the Kurds? Where would you think they're going to fall in the next 5 or 10 years?
I mean, they're Sunni Muslims, and but there are differences with the Arabs. That's an ethnic difference now, not a religious one. I guess in Iraq it's both ethnic and religious, because the Arabs are mostly Shiites, and I think the Kurds will fight for their autonomy, and the big question there is what Turkey does. If Turkey is very threatened by any assertion of Turkish autonomy in Iraq or in Syria, and
You mean Kurdish autonomy?
what did I say? I meant to say Kurdish. Sorry, thank you for correcting me. Kurdish autonomy is anywhere is a big threat to Turkey, and also there's a question of how pragmatic will the Iraqi government be? Are they willing to just let the Kurds do their own thing and export their oil and maintain a pretense that it's one country? The Kurds have won some kind of autonomy in Syria. They've fought the government off, and I think that they're sort of
And Al-Qaeda.
and fought Al Qaeda off also. Exactly. Yes. Right. So.
I see them as a possible emerging power, and so touching on the wild card aspect of it, I thought it was just kind of an interesting,
Okay,
little
yeah.
confusing point to have fun with.
Yeah, and I don't have any predictions there either. I'm not sure what's going to happen. Unfortunately, it started under George Bush, and it's gotten worse under Obama, as I think a lot of people in this room know, that the official line of the U.S. government is to bury its head in the sand and to deny that there's any problem with Islam, that Islam is a wonderful religion, and we're not to suggest that any of the problems in the Muslim world are due to Islam in any way, shape, or form. That's completely
The
terrible.
Obama administration has loaded his administration with Muslims.
Yes, I'm afraid he has taken on advisors who seem to have links to the Muslim Brotherhood.
The Iranians are well known for persecuting the Baha'is
Yeah, and in Pakistan, the Ahmadis are terribly persecuted.
by the Sunnis.
Yeah.
Do you know the relationship of the Shiites to the Ahmadiyya? That they just as
Let me read.
violent against them and
Let
putting
me,
them.
let me read you something from the Reliance of the Traveler. Hold on. Oh no, I've lost my place. Here.
Both Bob and Baha'u'llah and the Ahmadi sect guy, they all had green turbans because they claimed descendants. They claimed Muhammad as their great grandfather.
Right.
Next few centuries.
So here's the problem with the Baha'is and the Ahmadis. They follow a prophet who came after Muhammad.
Yes.
That's the problem.
That's, yeah.
And Muhammad said to his followers, there will be no prophet after me. And he, in his own lifetime, there was a man named Musaylima, Muhammad's contemporary, who claimed also to be a prophet. He sent a messenger to Muhammad. Hey, Muhammad, I heard that you're a prophet. That's fabulous. I'm a prophet too. We should get together. Muhammad replied by, his letter began, to Musaylima, the arch liar, from Muhammad, the prophet. The Muslim community went to war against Musaylima and his followers and killed them all. And that set a precedent for Islamic law.
Yeah.
The jizya, I mentioned this tribute payment that is taken from Jews, Christians, Samaritans, and Zoroastrians, in lieu of conversion, so that they can practice their faith in a limited way. It's not acceptable from any religion that comes after Muhammad. So let me here's the section in the Reliance of the Traveler. about non-Muslim subjects of the Islamic State. A formal agreement of protection is made with citizens who are Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, Samaritans, and Sabians. Such an agreement may not be effected with those who are idol worshippers or those who do not have a sacred book. As for the pseudo-scriptures of cults that have appeared since Islam, such as the Sikhs, Baha'is, Mormons, and Qadianis, that's another name for the Ahmadis, they neither are nor could be a book, since the Quran is the final revelation. So, in other words, and today, the most persecuted groups in the Muslim world, the most persecuted religious minorities are the Baha'is and the Ahmadis. The Mormons can't even get a foot in the door. They're not. I think I mentioned that in my talk on the Muslim Brotherhood. That in Egypt, the Mormons are just not legally tolerated at all. And the Sikhs are only safe because they're not living under Muslim rulers anymore. So, right. So
both the Shias and the Sunnis persecute.
Yeah, there's a small Baha'i community in Egypt, for example. They're terribly persecuted. Yeah.
In reference to 9/11, that came without warning. Like, I'm not asking you to convert. We're just going to come right after you. So.
Oh, okay.
That kind of.
It wasn't preceded by an invitation to convert.
Right. So.
But Bin Laden sent a letter to George Bush, and he also in his declaration of war, which is from 1996. Is that right? He had a formal declaration of war where I believe he did invite Americans to enter Islam.
And it was published.
Right.
Yeah.
So actually, yeah.
But how did they think they were going to take over the
That's
United
when you should
States
get nervous,
by-
when
Yeah.
you get a formal letter from
So,
Osama bin Laden inviting you to become a
if you
Muslim.
really think about it, they're not going to give up. I mean, even reference to the Boston bombings, they're planning their next move, I believe. So they're not going to give up.
There is a school of thought among classical Islamic law that if the invitation to Islam has been sufficiently publicized and broadcast, there's no need to repeat it, and you can just go to war without that initial warning and invitation and grace period.
You've already said it.
Right. So that they discuss this. There's a whole tradition of debate about these little niceties.
So our current president is not really on this issue. He has really no real revelation to really how to deal with this.
Yeah, he wants good relations with the Muslim world, and we have the worst relations ever. I mean, anti-American sentiment is at an all-time high in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Turkey, even in our alleged ally, in Egypt. Right? He was gonna reconcile the Muslim world to the United States of America,
But he had opportunities like in Iran with the Green Movement. Could have done something.
in 2009.
And he did nothing.
Right. Yes, right. Unaccountably. Yeah, who can figure it out? I mean, we intervened in Libya because Gaddafi was threatening to, gas his own people, But then in Syria, we don't intervene. Even though in Libya, Gaddafi had turned over his nuclear weapons and had basically given up terrorism. And Syria is openly aligned with Iran and up to its neck in terrorism and gassing its own people. That makes no sense. Nothing makes. Does any aspect of American foreign policy make any sense?
I don't think we know now what happened in Libya. I don't think it's clear why they intervened. I don't think.
Oh, there might be a backstory there that we haven't heard.
I don't know. I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
I don't know either.
It doesn't make any sense. It's threatened. I think Benghazi was, or one of the cities that were.
Yeah, in the east where there were a lot of rebels.
So they say, okay, we'll slaughter everybody. Well, it's happened every day, everywhere, right? So why Libya? So why suddenly Europe jumping around? Something it's not. I don't see
something
why.
doesn't add up.
Yeah,
I agree with you.
They're running weapons into Syria.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
You're coming
The winning side is
I'm not scheduled. I don't think I'm on the schedule for another class.
the victory.
Not that I know of.
So thank you very much to Professor Joe Spoerl. Whenever he speaks, I feel like I could just open his brain and pour some of it in mine. So really,
It's empty.
Joe?
Lot of places.
no, well, mediocre.
Can I ask you a question afterwards?
So it's great. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
It's great.